Today on the Roundhouse, we're learning about the overlooked history of hospital trains. All aboard!
In days past, the roundhouse was where the railroad worker united with the steam locomotive, each to prepare for the journey ahead. Today, it's where we examine the history, the industry, the machines, the hobby, and the passion behind railroading. News, interviews, stories, and more. So climb aboard. This is The Roundhouse.
Welcome to the Roundhouse. I'm your host, Nick Ozarek, and this is episode number 141 of our Trains and Railroad podcast, where we're talking about everything in the industry and the hobby. You name it, and we discuss it. Today, in honor of International Women's Day, March 8th of 2024, we are interviewing Alexandra Kitty, author of A Different Track, Hospital Trains of the Second World War. We'll be looking at the history of these trains, the design of them, and why this history has been so overlooked. Before we get to that, though, I want to thank those of you who are supporting the Roundhouse on Patreon. If you go to patreon.com/theroundhouse for as little as $1 a month, you're going to be helping to support what we do here on the show, and I appreciate that very much. And I want to thank the Mechanical Services Department of the Strasburg Railroad for sponsoring this episode. Learn more at mechanical.strasburgrailroad.com. Our guest today is the author of A Different Track, Hospital Trains and the Second World War, a history about hospital trains throughout the ages, but specifically focusing on World War II. Please welcome to the Roundhouse, Miss Alexandra Kitty.
Thank you for having me, Nicholas.
This is a piece of railroading history that, as long as I've been a rail fan, I've had an awareness that hospital trains have been a thing, but admittedly, not knowing much beyond that. So how did you become interested in the subject?
Well, my grandmother was a nurse on a hospital train in the Second World War. So she didn't really talk about it a lot. I always knew about it, but as she got older, she talked about it more and more. And I realized how much it meant to her and how little, it was not something I learned in history. It wasn't something, I picked up in books. So after she passed away a few years ago, because she was modest, she would have never agreed to have a book written about this because she was so modest. I decided I wanted to explore it more because I knew it from her perspective, but I didn't actually understand the whole of it. So I said, I want to go look. And when I realized there weren't any other books written about it, I thought, well, now I really have to double down and tease out whatever I can to write this because we need this for the historical record. So that's how I started. It was a family connection.
Perhaps you can provide us an overview of the evolution of hospital trains over the years.
Well, they predate even World War I. We're talking, in the 1800s. These were an afterthought. So they have trains carrying ammunition or supplies, and then they would have wounded people. So they would just kind of put the wounded people on a train and take them to hospitals. So that's how it started. In World War I, they were called ambulance trains. So they were a little more evolved in that we actually had a train that was designated to take the wounded to different hospitals, bricks and mortar hospitals, to see if they could save anyone. And this did wonders. So by the time it came to Second World War, this was more of a plan. These were renamed hospital trains. They were done differently and that there was a plan, and they kept changing them as they go along. So in the beginning of the Second World War, hospital trains were more crude than they were by the end of the war. So this was from starting as an afterthought to being an integral part of the war effort by the Allies and not any other side. So this is how this started. From not even, well, let's stick some wounded people in this car and see what happens, to, okay, we now have to look, how many people can we fit there? How many doctors? How many nurses? How do we make this, reinforce this? How do we keep supplies? How do we feed people? So from the beginnings of this, which were very crude and primitive, to being quite analytical and clever. That's the evolution of these trains in a nutshell.
It seems like, along with the evolution of the thinking and approach and strategy behind the trains, there was also an evolution to the equipment itself.
The beginning of the trains, as I said, didn't have very much in terms of being an actual mobile hospital. Even the ambulance trains were basically just taking people. They had nurses and doctors, but they were just to take people from point A to point B. By the time it was the Second World War, you had operating theaters in the hospital train. You had cooks, you had your dining areas, the doctors had their offices, you had your supplies, you had different wards in the hospital train. So from being just kind of crudely cobbled together to actually having a functional mobile hospital. So if you think of what we know as a hospital today with different floors, think of it as different cars, and that was what you had by the Second World War. They even had places where they could have put things for gaming, ashtrays for people to smoke on these trains. How do we disinfect things? How do we get in food supplies? So they would get feedback. So most of these were constructed in the United States by different companies. So they would get feedback from the doctors and the soldiers and the generals, and then they would just tweak things to be more. Because as the war changed, things would get better, things would get worse and better again. So they had to keep tweaking these trains depending on the location, depending on how fierce the fighting was, depending on how many casualties they were expecting, that sort of thing. If there was a different outbreak of some sort of disease or illness, they had to modify these trains constantly throughout the war so that it would reflect. So it was much more fluid than you would think. When you think of a train, you would think that, okay, they would make it like this and they would stick to this. And that's not actually what happened. They actually changed things as the years went by on the Second World War.
That's interesting to think of it as modular. Because, yeah, I think a lot of folks, even rail fans, when we think of trains, we think of sort of train sets. Like you have the constant amount of cars to do the job. But the modular element seems really strategically advantageous, especially when you consider that a lot of these trains were going right into the combat zones, correct?
Yes, and they were even bombed. That was the other thing. These were they were very vulnerable to bombing, and this happened very frequently. So they had some trains that were as small as 10 cars, and they had ones that were 25 or more. So they were different sizes. They were, depending on what happened. I mean, even when they were bombed, might be one car that's bombed, but the rest of it was okay. So they would just move on, and then they would have to replace what was damaged. So it was very modular because that was the way to ensure survival, not just of the staff, but of the patients in there, because the whole point of these trains was to ensure that, the walking wounded were tended to. If there were women that were going to go into labor, that they could look after them. If there was an illness, they could look after people. So it was always about how do we save as many people. So that becomes almost game theory. They had to constantly think, how do we maximize the number of people who survive? And that was basically the mandate of how to tweak these trains. And it was a resounding success. I mean, this made a huge difference in the war effort because they could save so many soldiers. They could patch up so many people that much more quickly. And that's how they could save, let's say, women. And they could, because I've met people who were born on a hospital train in the Second World War. This was common. There were quite a few people I know who actually ended up, they were given life on these trains. Their first moments of life were on these trains. So things had to constantly be tweaked depending on what was going on in the battlefield. And it was amazing how quickly they could adapt. When you're thinking these were made in the United States, brought over overseas, they were very responsive. This was actually a triumph in more ways than we actually realize.
The adaptability is really what's astounding. Our healthcare workers are heroes at any stage, today as they were in decades past. They've always been heroes. But to think of even in a modern setting, a healthcare worker on a train, and you have to deal with the forces of a moving train, and you're dealing with people who are possibly in critical condition that are requiring medical attention now, and you're dealing with the active combat zone, the possibility, despite the fact that the train has that red plus on the side of it, and Geneva Convention would dictate that you cannot attack that train, that they were still attacked. That is just so many layers. And then on top of that, something that you talked about in the book that adds to that is trying to scramble for resources. What were some of the stories that stood out to you as far as doctors and nurses having to use every means available to get the resources they needed to do their work?
Well, first you had doctors who had to bribe and blackmail to get things. And these, you have to realize, were ordinary everyday doctors, do no harm. These were not, street savvy people, but they learned on the job. Well, if I want to save people, I might have to bribe somebody, because there would be people preventing the trains from going forward, or, they would have to make deals with people. So here are doctors who were not actually used to that kind of way of life, finding they were actually very good at it. And then you had nurses who understood that they didn't have, a lot of times, anesthesia, they didn't have disinfectant, they didn't have food. So they learned to negotiate with farmers. So my grandmother would say a lot of times they would stop a train. If there was a farm, they'd ask the farmer, can we pick crops? And they would say yes. Not always, but a lot of times they would say yes. So they were nurses gathering resources. My grandmother would talk about, they would have U.S. soldiers in Army would parachute things, and they would take the supplies from these boxes, and then they would take the parachute and make clothing. So absolutely enough, there was nothing, you could waste nothing. So it was sort of like Quaker sensibilities, where nothing went to waste. So you would have to make deals with people. You might have to get nasty with people. You might ask to beg and grovel. You have to take whatever little you have and repurpose it, almost like upcycling. You had, okay, I have this box. How can I make this box into something we can use? How can I take this parachute and make it into something we can use? So the point of these, a lot of times people would come in thinking, all I'm going to do is, stitch up people. And you end up doing so much more. You're wearing a lot more hats than you actually ever bargained for. And a lot of that was, how do we get more supplies on these trains? Because people were constantly being wounded. This was a never-ending thing. These trains ran 24/7. It wasn't like, okay, we have Sunday off, or we can take Tuesdays off. You didn't take anything off. You didn't take a minute off. There were, nurses absolutely exhausted, but you had a job to do. Doctors exhausted, they had a job to do. And not just resources, they had to negotiate with time. Okay, we know something's going on up ahead. It's much more dangerous. How do we try to minimize that damage? So do we need to get a weapon? Do we need to fire back? What do we need to do? So these were people who became quasi-soldiers, quasi-negotiators, quasi-psychologists, because you had a lot of people on these trains who had shell shock. They had mental distress, and you can see people in peacetime on a plane and they have a meltdown. Well, you had people have meltdowns on trains, so you had a lot of nurses have to play psychologist and calm people down. So how do I calm these people down? There was somebody who died beside them. They are losing, their hope. How do I keep hope alive and get these people to either a hospital ship, or do I get them to a Mexican border hospital before it's too late? So they had to constantly negotiate with their entire environment, from the time to the food.
Part of what I also found really fascinating is how the roles and structures of hierarchy within the train looked so different than they might have during peacetime. In one part of the book, you talk about how women were sometimes given the opportunity to basically control the operations of the train. And I'm curious about how the roles were structured, especially in World War II, and how it was determined where the train went, and being able to process everything that's going on, especially with these trains going up to 25 cars or so?
Well, the doctors made the crucial decisions of who could be saved, who couldn't be saved. The nurses were more of the ambassadors and also getting feedback. So they would talk to patients, talk to soldiers that they came across, give that information back to the doctors, and there would be a cycle of what to do. And women were very much, because they were nurses for the most part, they were the face of the train. So they had a lot of goodwill with patients. They had a lot of goodwill with the soldiers they met, not just as wounded soldiers, but the ones who were transporting people in. So they would get a lot of intelligence and then let the doctors know where things were going. And doctors had to make different kind of decisions, and not the kind of decisions doctors usually make, because you're on a mobile train and because you're in the middle of war. You're making different kind of decisions. They're almost making military grade decisions because they were on these trains and they were in charge of things. So the doctors were basically the brokers. The nurses were the ones who were getting information and knew exactly what was wrong with the group of people they brought in. Was it walking wounded where they lost a limb? Was this women who were due to be in labor? Were these people who had illness? Were these people wounded in some other way? And a lot of times on these trains, they would take enemy soldiers. So you had to have a separate car for people who were on the other side, the fascists, the Nazis, and they would look after them too. So they didn't discriminate who they were looking after, but they had to make decisions. Okay, who's going to go on this train? Who's more critically wounded where we can take these people? These people can hold on to the next train coming, so they can't come on this train. They'll come on the next train. And it also a lot of times depended on the season. Winter, you had different calculations than you did in the summer, or you did in the fall. So they were constantly having to go back and forth, back and forth. The nurses would tell the doctors would tell the military would tell the corporations and the government what was going on, and then they would tweak things, this feedback loop, where they would have to make changes constantly depending on what was seen. So the nurses were very much almost like foot soldiers. They were also ambassadors. So you had a mishmash of clashing kind of roles. And doctors had to make decisions. Nurses had to make decisions. So there was a lot of autonomy, but there was also a lot of negotiation and collaboration between the nurses and the doctors.
While reading the book, it struck me that a number of times the information gathered was from news articles. And a lot of the news articles, especially in the 30s and 40s, have that sort of propaganda element, the here's our brave people doing the brave thing kind of tone about it. And you highlight some of the differences between the tone and what the public was seeing about hospital trains both before and during the war versus the reality. And I'm curious if you could explore that here a bit.
Well, there was two, basically, with hospital trains, very unusual kind of propaganda campaigns. So the first one was we don't actually think of propaganda being targeted toward governments. And the first one was corporations targeting allied governments and selling them the notion of using a hospital train. So they had a lot of pictures. If you look at the pictures the corporations gave to governments, they're almost funny. So they would bring these soldiers, actors on these gurneys, who there was not a drop of blood. Everything was like nicely pressed, no wounds. And they were showing these, look at the marvel of these hospital trains. Allied governments went for it. What's more interesting is that the doctors in Germany tried to tell their government they needed a hospital train, but the German government said no, because they were basically hinging their entire campaign on propaganda. And they didn't think they needed hospital trains, which tells you a lot of difference between survival rates between these two groups. So the first propaganda campaign was very successful, and corporations selling to governments, the only source of salvation is if we have these hospital trains and that we really put resources in them. The second one, which was also to me very interesting, which totally was the shift from thinking of things in a primal brute force sort of way in the public that will win us. But what hospital train shows that smarts, intelligence, analytical thinking will save the day. So hospital trains have doctors and nurses who are trained to heal. And then we have the technology, the people, the engineers who put these trains in, created these trains, manufactured them, had blueprints of them, that these will save the day. So when we had the the doctors and the nurses were the heroes, as you mentioned earlier, but it was very much in the forefront of, well, once these come, you'll be okay. Well, when you think about it, lots of people died in the war, even if they were on the train, but it gave people hope. And when the trains were there, became more of a symbol of not giving up. So a lot of times people lost their families, they lost their homes, they lost their communities, they were totally lost. But when they saw that train, they saw that Red Cross on the train, they could pull themselves together. They had a reason to fight for tomorrow once they hit the train, because even though there were bombs still, they weren't totally safe. They could have had soldiers throw bombs, grenades at them. They knew that if they just held on to the hospital ship or the actual bricks and mortar hospital, that there was a reason to rebuild. So it really, the propaganda, although it was more, now let's focus the world, we should think less in terms of being brute force winning the day, thinking of intelligence winning the day. But also, we don't have to worry as much because we have these hospital trains. You'll be healed the second you get on these trains. And that did a world of difference in terms of morale for Allied forces versus their enemy forces.
I hadn't thought about it like that. It's so easy to think about it just in terms of the logistics because we're looking at it from an analytical standpoint of what we know. But being in the situation, the thing that I was thinking about while you were talking about that was during COVID when some of the U.S. hospital ships, one was deployed to New York City, and I remember there being a lot of media coverage about that. So I think that sense of a hero is coming or heroes are coming is still very much alive, even though it takes on different shapes and forms in this day and age.
Well, you have a cavalry of soldiers, but you also have the cavalry of doctors and nurses. So you had two kinds of cavalry during this, where people could feel more at ease, even in the absolute chaos. Even in this chaos, there was order. And people always seek order. And these hospital trains were actually the symbol of not just healing, but of order. We're going to come in. There's a protocol. There's a routine. Even though a lot of things were on the fly, the routine was to heal you, to take you to a safer place. So now you can start grabbing your bearings because it's not over. You still have a chance to survive.
The Strasburg Railroad is an institution in the heritage railroad industry, and its mechanical services department is proud to lead the way. With the knowledge and experience that has created one of the most reliable steam railroading experiences in the country, the Strasburg Railroad is excited to offer their expertise to the rest of the industry. Strasburg's professional team provides consulting and technical assistance to take your steam locomotive or rail car project from idea to finished product. They stand behind their work and always strive to meet their customers' needs for quality, historic accuracy, and reliability at a price that is fair. Unlike many competitors, they feature a fully equipped boiler, rail car, and machine shop, so the work gets done in-house, helping you get more for your money. Send your inquiries to mechanical@strasburgrailroad.com and let the professionals get to work for you. With all of the incredible work that these trains did during World War II, there was still a lot of goodwill coming off of that because there were still companies producing cars in the US into the 50s. But it seems like after World War II, the significance of these trains was diminishing in conflict. Why?
Well, there were two reasons. One was basically women were the face of these. Everybody knew the hospital nurses because a lot of times people didn't even meet the doctors because the doctors would operate on these people. So they weren't really cognizant. They knew the nurses every day. And after the war, women kind of went back, back to their families, back to their home, and they didn't make a big deal of being a nurse. So they weren't looking for a recognition. So part of that was because it was associated with women. The second thing, which is a little more interesting to me, is that hospital trains during their heyday were considered cutting edge technology. So this was absolute. But then what happened in the Second World War was the atomic bomb. So once the atomic bomb kind of fell, we had something even bigger, grandiose in terms of technology that trumped the trains. So everybody forgot about the trains. What was the next big thing? Because there were a lot of technological breakthroughs and medical breakthroughs through the Second World War that a lot of people aren't aware of. And trains were one of them, but it was eclipsed by the bomb. So once the atomic, hit the front pages, it was very easy to forget about the trains because they weren't as bombastic of a invention as, these bombs that actually put an end to conflict. So this is where the hospital trains kind of fell by the wayside, which was a shame. They were used in the Korean War, and they were even used today, which a lot of people would be surprised. But their heyday was in the Second World War. That was when they were the pinnacle of what technology can do for people.
That's an interesting element of demise. A lot of times when we're talking about the demise of rail, it's the rise of the automobile, the rise of airplanes. But the rise of the atomic bomb and how it changed the scale of war, that's a different way of thinking about it for sure.
It sort of made the switch from being primal, brute force, survival of the fittest kind of thinking, lose way to analytical, study, be smart, go into STEM. That kind of just switched over how we saw what should be leadership. So that was also because after the bomb, that was sort of like the last word of it. And then people kind of slowly over the decades switched over to a different kind of emphasis on universities and emphasis on STEM. And that's the atomic bomb sort of kind of put that. But before that, we had hospital trains telling people, yes, technology is what's going to save us in this global conflict.
I want to take a look at how you approached documenting this history, Alex. When you decided that this was what you wanted to do, how did you go about the research?
Well, first of all, I remembered what my grandmother told me. So that was the easy part because she said that was one of the happiest times of her life because it was the first time she felt useful in the sense of belonging. And I understood that. So I understood that there was a psychological component that I had to look at. There was the historical component, the technological component. So you break this down. The problem when I was doing this book is I thought, okay, I'm going to look at other books that dealt with this subject and see what they had to say and go in a somewhat different direction, except I didn't have that luxury because I couldn't believe it. I thought there would be. And because World War II is one of those topics that, there's no end to wonderful, informative books. I thought, okay, this surprised me. So I had to go back. And where do you go back? Where it's decades, where most people who've done it, who were on these trains, in charge of the trains, are no longer alive. So I had to look at different publications of different languages. And I was still kind of striking out where I found information basically was old newspaper articles that talked about it a lot more than, that you would be surprised that it just kind of fell out of favor so quickly. Medical journal articles from the era, and there were books that mentioned this in passing. So I had to kind of cobble together information from different sources and kind of cross-reference and then look at, okay, what is there something here that's misinformation? Is there something here that's propaganda? How do you double check? How do you cross-reference and all that? So this was actually quite labor intensive, although I love research and that's something I do with all my books. This one was different in that I was, it was faded. It was not something that was discussed a lot. I had to find snatches where I could. And once I did that, I noticed that, I had to kind of look, okay, what What's the overall picture of these bits and pieces? Because there's a lot of things about hospital trains that have been forever lost in the historical record. I mean, it's gone. We don't have it, and there isn't any way we can get it. So from what we have, how do I describe this to people? What's the importance of it? There's a psychological component, which was actually first and foremost. There was the technological component. There was the medical component. There's the historical component. And you put this all together and you harmonize it. And that's how the book came about. It was a very a slow and methodical process. And it required a lot of patience, looking through old journal or medical journal articles, looking at old newspaper articles, and trying to see, is there any radio transcripts? Is there anything that I can find in terms of manuals of trains and things like that? So that's how I put it together, floor plans and the like.
What were some of the particularly interesting discoveries that you made, or that, as you were working with archivists or librarians or people involved in the research, that you unearthed where you or somebody else said, I didn't know that, or I wouldn't have expected that?
Well, there were quite a few things. I'll just name a couple. First, what surprised me was the role of women of laying down the tracks, and the women who made the trains and the women who manned the trains healing people. So you had not just women working on the inside of the trains, you had women who worked on the outside of the train and the actual train itself. So that to me was quite interesting, because we don't really talk about women's role in the Second World War. We don't really think about it. And yet here were women, and they were in the making the transportation of patients as smooth as possible. And we don't really think about that. So that I found really interesting. The second thing I found extremely interesting was how quickly they could make and modify these trains during war. So, there would be this constant feedback loop, because I just kind of assumed they made the trains, they sent them, and they didn't really do much with them. No, they constantly were listening. So when we talk about UX these days, user experience, they were doing that in the Second World War with the trains. This is exactly, we think of things when a website changes online because they get feedback from users. This was happening during the Second World War, which I found really funny. I also found it kind of interesting how corporations managed to talk the US and British and the French governments into going along with putting so much resources in these trains and their brochures and their photographs, and how they managed to talk the governments into this. And thank goodness that they did. This is not a knock. But how the doctors in Germany also tried to tell their governments the importance of these trains, and they were met with deaf ears. And I found that very interesting, that we had one side, with a decisive victory, and the other side that didn't. And one of the big reasons was because of the hospital trains. They managed to save people. And I think the last thing that surprised me was they had them even in North America. This is how they would fly people back home and then put them on a hospital train in Canada and the US and just deliver them, in their hometown on these trains. So you had hospital trains in war zones. You had hospital trains in North America during the same time. And both these trains were considered very much beloved. They absolutely were beloved by people, whether they were in war or whether they were in peace. So this was actually a symbol of goodwill, and it was a symbol of healing and a symbol of looking forward to tomorrow. So that all surprised me. I knew things from my grandmother's perspective, but to look at the big picture, there was all sorts of nooks and crannies that absolutely shocked me. They were obvious once I read it, but it wasn't obvious to me when I was doing my research.
That sense of optimism, I'm remembering passages that I was reading about the Canadian hospital trains and people coming back, and how there's this optimism that's communicated publicly about, look at these wonderful hospital trains, look at how they're bringing your loved ones home, and coming to terms with the fact that they were bringing loved ones home, those loved ones being very changed people in one form or another, and that being an important part of that story during the war and immediately after it when you still had plenty of people being transported home?
It was so interesting to see the coverage of in Canada, US, of the domestic hospital trains. They were given such prominence because that to people was sort of a sigh of relief. I mean, a lot of these people had psychological scars. Some people came back without limbs. Some people, couldn't function in certain ways. And yet that train just meant that a certain ordeal was over, and we'll deal with what happened afterwards as we go along. So the trains had such a powerful effect on people that they were just happy to see them. They were just the anticipation of waiting for a loved one, no matter how long, but you knew that they were on these trains and your turn was coming. And this is how these trains were perceived by people, not just in the press, but by regular citizens. So the trains were, as I said, one of the biggest symbols of hope, the biggest symbols of optimism. When we think of war as destruction, we rarely remember that there is construction, there is a reconstruction, and the trains represented both creation and recreation. We are rebuilding these people, we're rebuilding society, we're rebuilding after this war. And you would think there would be many symbols of this, and it actually came down basically to the hospital train.
Perhaps the part of the book that stood out to me the most is toward the end where you're talking about this question of why in a field of history where there are so many stories and so many ways in which those stories are told through books and movies and other forms of media, there's so much about these conflicts and people involved with them and top brass and all of that. And yet, not so much with those who worked on the hospital trains. And you touched on it a little bit earlier with the fact that so many of these women who were nurses or served in other roles just went back to their daily job. But I wonder, too, if part of that discrepancy of why is this underdocumented is simply the fact that we've had a culture that's idolized stories involving men, so the women just weren't being asked what they did at a time when they were alive and could have, not all of them might have, but some of them could have shared more of their experiences.
Well, women did get eclipsed. I mean, everybody was so happy that the boys came home. They didn't really remember that there were girls too. And in Canada, when they put out the call for volunteer nurses for these trains and ships, they had so many young Canadian women volunteer that they had to put a stop to it because they had more volunteers than spaces. So you had women very enthusiastically, teenage girls basically, go in. A lot of them lied about their age too. So you had a lot of young women, teenage girls go in there ready to die, ready to heal. I wouldn't and fight and fight to help other people live. Once that was gone, because you had a lot of Hollywood movies about soldiers, so people were basically primed to think of the soldiers of the men. They weren't actually thinking about the role women played. And that is why we've lost so much history here, because it was female centric at a time where that was kind of frowned upon. So women didn't, weren't talking about it when they should have. A lot of them would have loved to been able to share sorrows because they were, got attached to patients who died. Not everybody made it. A lot of things touch your soul. You might have been attacked on a train. Your train one of the cars might have been bombed, and people you cared about were on these trains. So that part of history was lost simply because when we think of war, we think of soldiers with weapons. We don't think of nurses healing you.
With that in mind, what are some of the other elements in play that you think have made it so difficult to be able to unearth this history, to be able to properly document it?
Well, first of all, as I said, a lot of people who were on the trains, a lot of them didn't talk about it. I mean, finding archives of doctors who talked about it was really difficult. I mean, I could find things in, in Hungarian or Polish or Russian, and I had to do the translation to find out information from the doctor's standpoint, because it wasn't, but even then, that was really like finding a needle in a haystack. Trying to find pieces of this puzzle where a lot of pieces are gone for good, that's not an easy thing to do. So you're trying to kind of piece things together. And yet so many people just kind of, once the war was over, because they didn't have quote unquote war stories, they just kind of went on with their lives, not thinking that that is actually part of the war story. So you even had doctors who sort of kind of went back to their regular practice and didn't really talk about it. You had nurses go back to their lives and not really talk about it. You had engineers who made the trains and didn't talk about it either. So it just sort of, people forgot, oh, we're back home, we're okay. We think just soldiers. We just think soldiers. And war is more than just soldiers. It was the way we kind of got focused, because we tend to be unifocused. So one thing, it's almost like monomania. One thing gets the spotlight and everything kind of else falls by the wayside. And you can see this. It's very, one thing is bombastic, everything else falls through the cracks. And unfortunately, hospital trains, which I think still had a lot of place, and we could have still used more of it, and we could have explored it more, kind of fell because you had bigger technology, you had bigger, more bombastic stories, and this was sort of quiet order, and people wanted to know more about the chaos.
So if your grandmother was still alive, Alex, and you knew you were writing this book, you did say that she was certainly one to not talk in great detail about it or brag about it. But if you could ask her one question that you think she might answer, what would it be?
Why didn't you talk about this more after the war? That's the question to me, is the $1 million question. She did so many things. So many people who she treated on these trains for years after the war would come visit her at her house from all over Europe, would make the trek to her house to thank her. Think of all the stories that get lost because there were people who remembered her. So I think she would have, I would love to have known more of these. I would have loved to say, could you please tell me more about these people who, remembered you years after? You would think they would want to forget. They were injured. They were on a train in the middle of the war. There's stench, there's chaos, there's violence. You would think they'd want to forget and move on. No, they wanted to just come personally to tell you that you changed their life. So why didn't you talk about this more? That would be my question to her. Like, to me, it was like such a beautiful thing. It was such a, tribute to her that people, and I'm sure she wasn't the only nurse who had people come after the war and say thank you. I would love to know, why was this so overwhelming? What made you want to not talk about it when, I think so many people needed to hear those stories? That would be my question to her, because she did amazing things on this train and she really blossomed. And, she learned so much, and she was such a firebrand. She was very much a progressive thinker, even during this time. She was not, any way a bigot. And the train showed her resilience and her open-mindedness and her caring. So why wouldn't you want to talk about so much? I mean, she did, and she regretted it. She really did regret not talking about it more during the last couple of years of her life. But I really wish she did talk about it to me as a kid, because I would have loved to hear those stories.
Something that you touch on there is this idea that while war is unquestionably a horrible thing, there are some tremendous acts of humanity and understanding that people on the ground can come out with. Looking today, so we're recording this in January of 2024, and it's almost 2 years into the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And an interesting coda to your book that you include is the fact that there have been hospital trains involved in that conflict. And I'm curious about whether the circumstances there that have led to that being an important element of the Ukrainian defense.
It's very important. I mean, when you think of the level of carnage during there, we're talking 6 figures of carnage. and that these trains are actually coming, picking up the wounded and doing what they did in the Second World War, but they're not getting their due. So we might hear a little bit about these hospital trains, but we tend to forget how decisive of a, you know, mechanism the hospital trains are. That it's kind of funny to me that we're not talking about these hospital trains. We're just going, oh, by the way, and there are hospital trains in Ukraine. Well, tell us more about it. It seems to be that this is, one of those technologies that is definitely more modest than it needs to be or should be. So we have the technology to transport people and heal them as they're being transported, and that we're still not really talking about the nurses on those trains, the doctors on the trains, how many people they've saved, how how have they changed since the Second World War, because they would have had to be different. So it's this curiosity that you would think that would be there, because they're so important, yet we don't actually think about these trains, and yet they have saved literally tens of thousands of lives over the decades, not just in the Second World War, but the First World War, wars before that, the Korean War, the war in Ukraine. They're saving people as we speak right now.
And now we have the opportunity, because we can recognize the mistakes of the past of where things have been underdocumented. Now we have the opportunity to rectify that situation and educate ourselves, both by being able to explore the material out there as well as to talk to these people and get these stories documented. That is such an important element. My last question for you, Alex, is that what do you hope people take away from reading your book?
Well, quite a few things, but one of the things I would like people to get come away with is that there's always going to be secret history. There's going to be things that are very important, that are crucial, that we don't think of. We think we know the whole picture, and we kind of get full of ourselves. Oh, this is what happened. Well, are you sure that you know what the full picture is? Because with hospital trains, how many people would the Allied forces have won if so many people weren't saved by hospital trains? That's an important question. Would it have been worse? What happened? Who met who on these trains? How did technology kind of gain dominance thanks to hospital trains? So one of the things that people should come away with is that there's always secret history, and there's always more to be learned, and that when we learn more, our understanding of things we already know changes. The second thing I hope people get out of this is the importance of order and healing in even the most chaotic of situations. People tend to be very negative, very pessimistic. They tend to panic, and they forget there are people who are willing to, stick their necks out there and volunteer, not for the glory, but because that's who they are. Their emotional component is empathy, it's healing, and that there are altruism, and there are people who work tirelessly, and they actually enjoy saving people, helping people, and not expecting any kudos or rewards or even recognition. They do it because it needs to be done. And that might also explain why hospital trains were kind of forgotten after the war, because the people on the trains who were attracted to helping other people thought, okay, my job is done, it's over. And they didn't want to talk about it anymore. So we have a whole bunch of things that go on, that hospital trains really represent secret history, but they also represent people's kindness in the absolute worst of situations and to total strangers. They never met these people. They're not going to get anything out of them. And yet they have no problem helping people, not asking anything, second guessing them. And they just help them and just move along.
A secret history that hopefully, as time goes on, becomes slightly less secret, especially where we are seeing history repeat itself in a form, and now we have the opportunity to pursue documenting that and understanding that as best we can. And as you observe, finding the good and the good deeds within these chaotic landscapes. Her book, A Different Track, Hospital Trains of the Second World War, is available online. I'll have a link in the show notes. Alex, thank you so much for joining us here on The Roundhouse to talk about this really fascinating history. of hospital trains and, in general, the importance of documenting this history while we have the ability to.
Thank you. I enjoyed it very much.
And now, the question of the day.
Last time on the Roundhouse, we talked to Mark Rayum, who is a composer who combined classical music with railroad documentary storytelling. A very interesting premise, which led to the question of, what is your favorite musical piece about railroading? Loads of responses, loads of links to songs, which I appreciated you submitting. First, from the roundhousepodcast.com, Dale Oswald writes, my favorite train song is Pat Metheny's Last Train Home. It has a steam engine rhythm, and its sound evokes a feeling of a journey to a good place. From Facebook, Jack Nikolai writes, specific railroad, cargo moving people by the Norfolk and Western. In general, Tucson Train by Bruce Springsteen. Don Mason says, my favorite harp player, Sonny Terry. I was fortunate to see him and Brownie McGee several times at the Main Point in Bryn Mawr, PA, and the Philadelphia Folk Festival. And having listened to the Sonny Terry song, it makes me think of the Railroad Tycoon 2 soundtrack, which is an absolute masterpiece. Lastly, Claire Latrella writes, we're Bessemer and Lake Erie by Nick Ozrak. Not gonna lie, this was extremely well done. Wait, somebody cited... Wait, what does that mean? Okay, so quick backstory, and you can check this out on YouTube. Back, 5 years ago, I think it was, I had an idea for a song parody, changing the lyrics to Radioactive by Imagine Dragons about the Bessemer and Lake Erie Railroad. And you can check it out on YouTube. Just search Bessemer and Lake Erie. It's one of the top results that you'll see on the website. That was a lot of fun to write. So thank you, Claire. I appreciate that. Your question of the day for this episode is, what is a piece of railroad history that you feel is overlooked? Let me know on the roundhousepodcast.com. Links to social media are there. It's always great to have these conversations here on the Roundhouse because, as you guys know, the Roundhouse is our house.